Hi guys, it's Vina and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a book review of The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. So The City of Brass is an adult fantasy novel, and it is about a girl named Nahri who lives in Cairo and is a healer and a con artist. And during one of her cons, she accidentally summons a djinn who reveals a whole new world to her that she had never believed in before. And so they travel together to the city of Daevabad, which is the capital city of the jinn, where there is a lot of political intrigue going on. And that is kind of the basic plot. This book is very heavily centered on Middle Eastern and Islamic folklore and mythology. I really wanted to love this book. I had seen a lot of great reviews of it, people hyping it up all over the place. On Bookstagram, I saw a lot of people saying that it was such a fantastic fantasy series, and I've been trying to read more adult fantasy. I've been trying to branch out of my comfort zones in terms of reading, and I really want to read more adult fantasy since YA fantasy really isn't cutting it for me anymore. And so I picked up this book because it sounded just really good. So I'm going to go through this book kind of piece by piece and kind of break down exactly what I liked and didn't like about it. There will not be spoilers. I will try to keep this as spoiler free as possible. If I do need to get into spoilers, I will be putting warnings and timestamps so that if you don't want to see any spoilers for this book before going into it, you can just skip ahead. So I'm going to start by talking about the world building. So the world building in The City of Brass was probably my favorite aspect of the book. I really loved it, at least for the most part. I did really like that it is technically historical fantasy. I didn't expect it to be historical fantasy when I went into it, but it is actually set during the Napoleonic Wars after Napoleon has invaded Egypt, which I think was very interesting. I wish that had played a bigger role in the story. It was more of just a backdrop setting thing. I wish that the Napoleonic Wars had actually affected what was happening in the rest of the plot, but it didn't really. I still did like that aspect though. I think that that's a very interesting time period, and I've not seen a lot of fiction really exploring that particular time period in that area, and so it was very interesting to see that. I loved all of the rich cultural details that the author wove into the story. It felt very real and vibrant to me, and I really did love that. The magic system is very soft, but for the most part, it worked very well for this story. It played into the mythological aspects of it very well. Towards the end, however, I did find that I was very confused by the magic, because when you have a soft magic system, it's very hard to set defined rules for it and kind of boundaries. And so at the end, I wasn't really sure where the boundaries had gone and what was going on with the magic. And so that was kind of frustrating. But for the most part, I did really enjoy the setting and the magic system. So now I'm going to talk about character development. And this is probably the thing that made me dislike the book the most. And I feel really bad about that, because I did really want to love these characters, but for the most part, I didn't love them as much as I wanted to. So let's start with the main character, Nahri. Nahri annoyed me. She reminded me of Lila Bard from A Darker Shade of Magic, but more annoying, if that's possible. And I just couldn't understand her decisions. It felt like some of the decisions that she made in the story were literally just to propel the plot forward, and they didn't seem to make sense with what we'd previously been told about her personality, her backstory, and her decision-making skills. I was frustrated by this, obviously, and so that really immediately made me like her less. I also never really got a sense of her personality beyond her being a con artist and a thief, and I didn't really get to see what made her complex and gave her humanity. I never really got to see her humanity in a way that felt real and organic. Instead, everything about her kind of felt stiff and stilted, and I can't really pinpoint exactly why, but I just couldn't connect to her character. I also found her character arc was a little bit odd. And I can't really say too much without getting into spoilers, but the way that her character arc ends up going and the way her change arc ends up developing is in a direction that makes no sense with what happens previously. So there isn't a well-defined character arc that bridges the entire storyline. Instead, it seems like it's a little bit choppy and messed up. So towards the end, towards the climax of the book, there is a scene where Nahri is shown to be doing something that's against her character. It's not what she would have done at the beginning of the book, apparently. My problem with the scene and what she ended up doing was that she had already grown at that point. She had already, finished that character arc. If she'd ever grown in that area to begin with, that scene has already happened in the first quarter of the novel, and now we're repeating it, but it seemed like the narrative was trying to build it up to be this really big climactic moment where she changes and her character change is really showcased. But the problem is that scene fell flat because we'd already seen her doing the exact same thing a quarter of the way through the book. And so I was a little bit weirded out by the way her character arc ended up going. I really didn't understand her character arc, and that was obviously frustrating as well. So now moving on to the love interest, Dara. So Dara is basically 4 from Divergent, and that should probably tell you exactly how I felt about him. He's a jerk. He's one of those bad boy characters who has a tragic past, and so that's his excuse for being a jerk to everybody else. His character had potential to be interesting, but I feel like it immediately devolved into a stereotype. It didn't have to, but that's where it ended up going. Honestly, I kind of hated his relationship with Nahri, and I will be talking about that more when I get onto the plot, but I feel like their relationship didn't have much chemistry. So now I'm just going to quickly talk about the only character that I actually liked in the book, and that is Prince Ali. So the reason that I liked Ali was because I really appreciated the way that his moral dilemmas were written. I think that it was very interesting and complex. It made it very interesting to read about. I liked the political atmosphere of his chapters as well, and I liked that he actually cares about his family. He's not a character that I would say is like one of the greatest characters I've ever read about, but he was the one that I was rooting for the majority of the book. Something happened towards the end with him that was a little weird, and I will be talking about the end of the book in the plot section of this review because, oh boy, there's a lot to unpack. But overall, I did really appreciate Ali's character, and so he was probably my favorite. As for the secondary characters, there were a lot of them, and so sometimes it was very, very hard to keep track of who was who and who was allied with who and whose side everybody was on, because there were just so many characters and so many different names that it was hard to keep track. Sometimes a character would be called by their title, and then they'd be called by their first name or their last name, and it was very, very hard to keep track of who the heck was who. Eventually I did work out who most of the characters were, and I did end up liking some of them. I did really like Nahri's assistant, Nazreen, and I also liked the captain of the guard, Jamshid, but most of the characters I didn't really care about. There were just so many of them that it was very hard to get attached to any of them or understand them at all or even remember that they exist. I'm not, a stranger to large casts of characters, but this was just confusing to me for some reason, and I don't know why, because normally I'm fine with large casts of characters, but in this case, it was just too many. Alright, so now I'm going to be talking about the plot. So the plot for The City of Brass was extremely slow to start. I listened to this on audiobook and I would just pause in the middle of paragraphs, in the middle of chapters, because I just couldn't find the motivation to keep listening. The pacing was just wonky. There was stuff happening all the time, but it just didn't engage me very much, and this could definitely be because I wasn't attached to some of the characters, because I was engaged during Ali's POVs for the most part. Towards the end, it did get better in terms of pacing, but the climax was a little bit ridiculous. I don't even know what was going on in that climax. There were just some really weird stuff started happening. This is the point where the magic system just got very, very confusing and jumbled, and I really couldn't understand what was going on with the magic. I did understand what was happening, but it was very, very odd. It wasn't what I was expecting, and not necessarily in a good way. This climax just didn't make sense to me. So I am going to have to briefly talk about spoilers. I'll be putting a timestamp on the screen and you can just skip ahead to that point if you don't want to hear this. So the climax of the novel is when Nahri is kidnapped by Dara, who wants to take her away to some allies of his, and he also kidnaps Ali, and they are taken to this lake where they're going to get across the lake and escape Davabad. But Ali's brother and a bunch of soldiers are already there on boats because Ali has set up the whole thing. That wasn't explained. It wasn't explained how Ali knew he was going to be kidnapped. It didn't explain any of that. It didn't explain how Ali knew where they were going to come out of the secret passage that Dara used to escape. And so there was a lot of unexplained stuff at the beginning of the climax. And then as the climax develops, Nahri manages to figure out how to control Dara by accident, and Dara becomes this like berserker basically and just takes out a bunch of people. And it was never explained why Nahri could do that. And then Dara kills Ali, and Ali falls into this lake, which is said to be cursed. And then the creatures in the lake possess Ali, send him back onto the ship for him to kill Dara. First of all, it was never set up prior in the book that the water spirits, I can't remember their names right now, I'm sorry, it never set up that they could possess people. And so there was just a bunch of unexplained stuff going on in the climax that just made it really ridiculous to me. I still don't know what the heck was going on with that climax. The denouement of the book, however, was good. I liked it. I thought that the way that the political stuff was tied up while also leaving loose ends for future books was very well done. I liked the questions that were raised in the denouement. I personally don't think I will be continuing reading these books, but I do think that the way that the book ended was very, very good. So now I'm going to just briefly talk about the romance subplot, and I won't talk about it for too long because there's really not much to say. I didn't like it. It literally came out of nowhere. It was very insta-lovey, and there really wasn't much chemistry or connection between the characters. The romance seemed to literally be built up around physical attraction between the two characters, which don't really like that. It should have gotten more development. It should have taken more time to develop properly, and there should have been actual chemistry between the characters first. I'm of the mind that if you have, you know, a series of books, you might as well spread out the romantic subplot over multiple books, but that's just my opinion. So the last thing that I briefly want to talk about is writing. So for the most part, the writing was solid. I liked it. It was good. It did feel way more YA than I had signed up for though, and I'm not talking necessarily in terms of the way that the book was written. So I have no problem with YA. I love YA. I read YA all the time. This book definitely had more politics. A lot of YA fantasy tends to not focus so much on politics because of the age group that it's marketed towards, but the romantic subplot was very YA, and Nahri herself felt very much like a YA protagonist, and Dara felt very much like a YA love interest. And so it did read YA. Even though it's technically marketed as adult, I would say that it reads more like YA than adult, which again is not a bad thing, but it wasn't what I personally signed up for. So that is my review of The City of Brass. So I didn't end up really loving this book. I ended up giving it 2 out of 5 stars, but I did really like the setting, and I do really love what the author was trying to do with this book. I honestly wish I had loved it more. I really did want to love it, but I just had too many issues with it to really fully enjoy it like I wanted to. I really hope that this review was helpful for you guys. Have you read this book, or are you planning on picking it up? Please let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more of my content. I post videos every Monday and Friday. I will see you guys again very soon. Bye.